What's going on, everybody? Happy Stoppage Time, Friday, August 9th. I hope you are having a fantastic kind of wrap up of your summer. For my friends in Europe, this is your big summer month. This is the time everybody takes off and does holiday. But for those in the US, this is when school starts. School starts in a couple weeks here for most places in Southern California, or next week. Yeah, the vibes are definitely kind of like sliding through these dog days of summer into the fall. But I had a lot on my mind this week. It was kind of a bit of a continuation, not surprisingly, my brain works the way that it does. A bit of a continuation from last week's thoughts about optimism and our choices that we get to make in transition. But this week it was really three big stories that kind of drove my attention. One, elections, our presidential election cycle here in the US and its campaign. Two, our Olympics coverage, the actual media coverage of the Olympics. And then three, earnings announcement from Disney this week. And why these three stories kind of resonated with me and stuck in my mind kind of all week was because of a common thread that I saw. And it was this idea that kind of each of these different topical stories and all the news stories or social media stories, posts often that were written about these three big topics, in my mind, not the only three topics that were going on in the world, but the three that got my attention most of the week, was that they all the coverage kind of started out like cynically, pessimistically, negatively, a lot of negative, cynical hot takes on why this was bad or why it wasn't going to work or why this was not possible. And then miraculously, in the span of a week, by today, by the end of this week, as we head towards the weekend, and we have found that almost unanimously in all three of these big kind of topical stories of the week, the coverage and the perception of the experiences and the reality of the experiences for all of us as viewers, consumers, the media critics class, etc., has flipped its script and become like really positive and really optimistic and really joyful about the experiences and the usefulness of the technology and the methods in which things were covered. And I just find that fascinating, right? So like if you deeper dive, it's just in each story's case, what struck me, right? Like in the election coverage, setting aside your political preferences for a second and just being honest about human nature, the Democratic candidate, our vice president, selected her new running mate, and the two of them just went on this offensive this week that is joyful. And they've re-seized the message around building for the future and a hopeful optimism and a redefinition of kind of, frankly, the original definition of what it means to be patriotic or what it means to be American or what it means to have freedom and what freedoms are and all that. And just, again, in the span of a week, we went from cynical, dark, destructive, negative, fearful, kind of biased nature discussion into this optimistic, hopeful, joyous energy. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing in the political discourse of any country. It's a good thing for us right now as a country. And it's just a good thing for humans, for all of us as human nature. So the fascinating thing was that, as you know, huge Olympics guy, consuming tons of Olympics content. And the cynicism and the skepticism from like the end of last week to this week about the coverage of the Olympics, and specifically like NBC Universal's coverage, and how they were putting the package and the coverage decisions together, and the programming choices and the host choices and which sports were getting coverage versus which weren't, and all this like suddenly flipped. And all of a sudden now by the end of this week, everybody is in love with the fact that Peacock, the streaming service from NBC Universal, which has been moderately growing and modestly successful, carving out its way, trying to figure out what it is in the greater landscape of media, it is now being praised as like just this awesome kind of self-driven, flexible, creative, viewer-centric tool that can be utilized to consume content on demand the way you want, feeding your needs, and not beholden to the greater narrative of the networks, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, yeah, that was always the plan. Like that was always literally what they were telling us was going to happen. But like we're incapable of being patient enough to simply allow things to unfold and happen. which is just blows my mind. And that leads me to kind of this last story, the story about Disney. Guess what? Disney's profitable. They turned a profit again. Guess what? Slowly, Bob Iger is turning the company around, is rescuing the company from where it was mired under his previous leadership of Bob Chapek. Guess what? Like, their streaming services, Disney Plus, dominated by Disney Plus, are turning a profit and are believed to be heading towards greater profitability in the coming years, right? Like, they have started to figure this out, so to speak. And again, not surprising. That was what we were told what was possible. But we live in this consciousness of cynicism and negativity and skepticism and pessimism, and nothing can work, and it has to be now, and we need results in real time. And why is that problem that I face every day when I walk out of my house, why does it still exist, and why hasn't it been fixed yet, in spite of the fact that, say, that problem, maybe homelessness in the current circumstances, was created by a series of decisions and non-decisions by all of us collectively over like 40 years. So why hasn't it been solved and completely eradicated in a year? Well, because that's just not how fucking life works, right? So these three stories, the Disney earnings turn, and the fact that we've got profitable streaming services now inside of Disney, Disney Plus, the fact that Peacock is heading towards a profit and is apparently delivered the greatest Olympic viewing, user-centric, kind of viewer-centric viewing experience in the history of the Olympics, thanks to NBC Universal's choices. And then the fact that even in an election campaign, in the most cynical, kind of angry and dark of times, here in the US, that politicians and people could choose to lean into the optimistic, into what's possible, into the future, into a vision that says this is the version of the future that we would like to see, and this is how we're going to build policies to get there. Again, you can disagree with that. You can say, like, I'd like to see a different version of the future. That's fine, but you can't deny human nature that optimism has now become an option, right? And hopefulness has become a choice. Which is, again, what was on my mind last week, right? The idea that in these transitional moments in our own lives, in our businesses, and in our cultural societies at large, kind of the larger arc of humankind in existence, we're presented with these moments when we have choices to make. And my choice is always to lean into the pragmatic optimism. My choice is always to lean into the joyfulness. Hell, that's why we're doing what we're doing here with the Storytellers Company, right? Is that I believe, and we're exhibiting it to our flagship products like this show, Stoppage Time, and like our main flagship show, the Entrepreneurial Thinkers show, that we produce weekly. I fundamentally believe that optimistic, less cynical, more everyday stories of the everyday average entrepreneurial thinker, the everyday average entrepreneur, the everyday leader, not necessarily only the winners, not necessarily only the quote unquote success stories, but the stories in progress are the stories that need to be told, because that's what we all are. We are all in progress. Only some minuscule, fractional, tiny segment of us is the supposed quote unquote successful elite part of society. Like, there's a tiny fraction of society, and yet our storytelling, our media storytelling, our business storytelling is so inordinately focused on those people that we wind up lionizing like a half dozen to a dozen people across everything. And then inevitably those people over time prove out to be not exactly who we thought they were. And then what have we done? We've mortgaged ourselves to the altar of their quote unquote success, instead of just telling the story of like the woman next door, or the guy down the street, or the one that looks most and sounds most like us in the mirror of our entrepreneurial experiences. So that's why I'm so deeply passionate about what we're doing. That's why we're raising money from you all, not just from the rich folks, to try and tell these stories, because fuck, we just need more of this. We need more Olympic coverage the way that it is. We need more belief that like eventually the Disney Pluses of the world would become successful and would become utilization or become tools that we would utilize in how we viewed and consume content. Not this idea that like, well, how we view content is just going to explode and it's never going to be the same and it's all woe is me, doom loop stuff. Like, it's just nonsense. So again, I get super fired up about this, not just because I'm a pragmatic optimist myself, but because like in our shows, that we do. And this week in particular, the last 2 shows that we dropped, right? So over the course of the last 10 days, we dropped 2 different shows. We dropped Adela Jamal's shows, the managing partner at Mile Mark Capital, where she joined us and she just inspired us and reminded us about the power in our diversity and the power in different viewpoints and the power in looking at things from a pragmatic optimist standpoint and betting on the people that are building and creating and trying to solve the problems of the future, right? And she did this in an interview. It's like she joined me from late at night in India, even though she's from here. She lives here in Los Angeles. She was back home in India, and she joined me late at night because she's so passionate about talking about these truths, right? And so like that episode is out there for you to watch on our YouTube channel and on any audio channel where you listen to your podcast, right? But then also this week's show, Morgan Barrett, where we dropped his audio. We'll drop his video on YouTube next week. But Morgan, I mean, here's a lawyer turned community builder. Here's a lawyer who eschewed the elitist kind of high-end white shoe, white glove law firm career path, to be, in his own words, more connected to the people, to be able to make a bigger difference in the lives of the clients, to be able to essentially live out the values that his father raised and imbued in him, which were creative, entrepreneurial, adventurous, joyful, right? And so I get to share in that. Yes, I am a pragmatic optimist, but more importantly, I'm just a conduit on Entrepreneurial Thinkers. I'm a conduit in the products that we create through the Storytellers Company and the stories that we tell. I'm a facilitator to help you connect with the stories and the points of view of these people, to connect to their wisdom, to connect to their positive energy, to connect to their optimism for what's possible in our entrepreneurial economies as well as in our societies and worlds at large. So I can't think of a better way to wrap up a Stoppage Time episode like this than to hit with a book recommendation, which is a book that I read during the pandemic from the famous Prof G from Scott Galloway, the NYU marketing professor now turned TED talker and podcaster extraordinaire, called The Algebra of Happiness. I remember correctly, I was on a series of airplanes across Latin America while I was listening to this book, and I found it just deeply inspiring. Simple. The summary of it from the New York Times is that it's an unconventional book. I would glance away here. It's an unconventional book of wisdom and life advice from a renowned professor, right? And that's really what it was. And I have an affinity for Scott, for his point of view. We don't always agree on everything, but I have an affinity for the way he wrote this book and the way he's written his book subsequent to this, because he and I are largely in the same age bracket. We're roughly the same age. He's a little bit older than I am. He won't like me saying that. But I think if you're looking for kind of a simple roadmap with sprinkled with a little bit of inspiration, with a little bit of pragmatic advice, but also with a bit of optimism and hopefulness for the future and what's possible, I think you'll really enjoy this book. And again, on a rant like today, where I was inspired on how I watched the big media stories of the week shift from these negative, cynical, pessimistic headlines and vibes completely towards a more optimistic, a more hopeful, a more empowered and inspired positive view of how things can exist for us in our world and how we are capable of making the world better. I can't think of a better thing than to end with a book called The Algebra of Happiness, right? The roadmap to help you figure out how to get there. So that's our stoppage time for this week. I hope and wish and bestow upon you a bunch of love, joy, happiness, encouragement into your stoppage time between the end of your Friday work week and the beginning of your weekend this summer. But I also hope that I can instill and maybe inspire a little bit of pragmatic optimism into your life, that when you're presented with opportunities in the next days and coming weeks to analyze something and think either cynically or pessimistically or negatively about it, maybe you stop for a second, take a deep breath, and just seek out the pragmatically optimistic path in that reality. And then just lean into that, because it'll not only make our world a better place for all of us, but it'll make your life on a daily basis a slightly better, less stressful, less anxiety-ridden place to exist. And I can promise you that, because that's the journey I've been on over the last 10 years. So peace, love, happy stoppage time, and happy Friday.